Plain old JavaScript objects versus Ember objects. Plain old JavaScript objects, also known as POJOs, are what JavaScript just natively provides you as its object model. And I have an example of that up here. This var POJO equals this sort of JavaScript object notation with the property foo, and then y is the property with its inner object, which has a property m with its inner object, the property c, and then a is a string, it's fun. So it's kind of well known that Ember has its own proprietary object model that you can use that'll add sort of lots of fancy possibilities for building your Ember apps, such as using bindings and computed properties. And it's not immediately clear to beginners where the magic kind of begins and ends with Ember objects, and what the relationship between an Ember object is and a plain old JavaScript object. So the purpose of this little mini Ember, whatever we're calling it, is to make that a little bit more clear. So I got a quick example here of a plain old JavaScript object and an Ember object defined with exactly the same properties and the same sub-objects and so on and so forth. And I've got, just for the purpose of displaying, two little paragraph tags with these spans that'll be filled with the content of whatever property lookups that we perform, just to demonstrate the similarities, the differences between a POJO and an Ember object. So right now it's just saying it's fun because what I'm doing is doing a POJO.ymca lookup in Ember object.ymca lookup, and it's just starting from the top of these objects and saying this.y.m.c.a, it's fun. And I mean, the first thing to notice is that this dot notation, which is what is always going to work with a boring plain old JavaScript object, is working totally fine when we apply it to this Ember object, which, if you've gone through the tutorials and you've known that Ember objects have a thing called getters and setters, and you know, there's another way that you could have written this Ember object example, for instance, using a getter, which would do exactly the same thing, yield exactly the same output as the sort of native dot syntax above. So if you've seen that Ember has this, and it might not be clear when you need to use .get versus when you can just get away with this dot syntax. And it really just comes down to, if you have an Ember object and the properties that you want to look up are just static properties, primitive values, plain old JavaScript objects, basically anything that is not the magic that Ember adds, then you can just use this dot syntax, the one that you're familiar with from your pre-Embery days, and it'll work just fine. If you start using computed properties or bindings or any of this other magic, which you know just can't possibly exist in normal JavaScript land, you're probably going to have to use this get notation. So even if you weren't getting into the bindings computed properties land, this getter has some nice properties about it, which you can't really get away with if you're just using dot notation. So for instance, what if we were working with lots of objects that generally had this format, but at any point, any number of these, y, m, c, a, could be null. So to look something like this, right? So Ember object has a y property, which has an m, but m is null. So if we were to say Ember object.y to mca using this dot notation lookup, we would get an error, which we can sort of guarantee here. So if we look at our console, we should get some error. It says cannot read property c of null, and that's because by the time that we get to m here, which is null, if we do null.c, that's obviously going to be this type error. So one of the things that's nice about the getter, the .get version, is that you can give it a path of a property path to look up, and it'll gracefully fail and just return, I think, null or undefined. I don't remember the one off the top of my head. Probably undefined. If you give it a path that starts to go into like a null region, and at this point it's not going to error out, it's just going to say, okay, y.m.c.a is undefined. And we can guarantee, I mean, it's giving the same output, but it's not actually giving you an error up here in the way that was before when we were doing a dot property lookup. So that's kind of a nice thing, because if you had to do something like that in the sort of, let's try the same thing with plain old JavaScript object up here. If we just say that from M onward it's null, then we're going to predictably get our error that we had before. And if you wanted to actually account for this, like if you wanted to actually gracefully fail in case any one of these could be null, you'd have to do something like, I don't know, why M. You have to do like one of these ugly combinations of and pojo.y. I'm sure I'm butchering this a little bit, but bear with me. It's just a tricky thing to get right because it's just kind of crappy when you have to deal with this situation and you don't have a nice abstraction on top of it. M and C and A. And what we've got is, which one am I doing here? Oh, I have my old non-working Ember version. I'll go back to the one that uses .get. So if I look at the console, it's displaying nothing as it should because it failed to look anything up, and that's what I'm passing into this text content here. But it's not getting any errors, so we fixed that problem, but this is the sort of ugly chain of ands that we have to put together to handle this case when you're dealing with objects where it might be this nested structure, but it might just fail at any point. So that's one of the reason I'm going into this is that this is one of the nice things that's handled for you if you're using a getter. And I'm guessing that your next question probably is, well, it's nice that you can use .get on an Ember object, but it still requires that you are working with an Ember object to begin with, because obviously you can't just take a normal plain old JavaScript object and say .get, because Ember doesn't extend that prototype to add get in any way, because that'd be crazy. So what you could do is internally Ember object.get is going to immediately call this global Ember.get, which you can use, which is a nice utility function, which is you might find yourself using it if you don't have a guarantee of what is going to be passed to you is a plain old JavaScript object or an Ember object. So here's an example of how you use it. And again, the point of all this is to bring some of the .getter niceness that you can get out of using an Ember object and bring it to plain old JavaScript land. So the way Ember.get works is that you pass the object that you're going to be looking up properties on, which is going to be Pojo, and then you pass the exact same thing that you would have just passed here in the single argument to an Ember object.get, MCA. You're passing it a property path. And this is going to do exactly the same thing that this does. Internally, this thing immediately calls Ember.get this, and then the property path that you passed in. So let's see this work. And remember, we still have these things as null, so nothing's showing up quite yet, but we also don't have any errors in the console. And if we bring this back to actually demonstrate this is doing what we expect, then we see Pojo is getting its deeply nested y.m.c.a property lookup just fine. And that's all this is just using a sort of Ember getter utility, which works for, you could pass a plain old JavaScript object as the first object that you're going to be looking up properties on, or you could pass an Ember object, and it's basically a way of, if you don't know whether what you're passed is a plain old JavaScript object or an Ember object, you can just use Ember.get, pass the object you want to do lookups on, and pass YMCA. So this is a pretty nice thing to know about, and hopefully gives you a little bit of a better idea of where some of the magic begins and ends. I mean, again, you can just do ember.y.m.c.a and it'll work just fine, because nothing that you're looking up involves bindings and computed properties and things that are strictly in the realm of like the Ember magic that Ember adds. But also, if it's just convenient to have something like Ember.get, because it's just a utility function that can gracefully fail in case any of these property lookups, these chain property lookups, happen to come up null. So one sort of last thing I'll say, because these things have a tend to bloat even beyond anything I would have ever planned, is, and you know what, I'm going to save it for later. It's going to be an example of bringing the Ember magic of computed properties and bindings into the picture, and then how ember.get gracefully handles that. But that'll have to be saved for the next Ember, whatever the heck we're calling this thing. All right, that's it. Have a wonderful day, and let me know if I can make these things even more clear. And let me know if there's any particular topics that you want me to cover. I am MACHTY on Twitter, and I'm in the IRC a bunch under Ember.js. So come check me out there and let me know what I can do better. Thanks.